As Book TV on C-SPAN 2 continues, Independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont discusses the 8.5-hour speech that he delivered on the Senate floor on December 10, 2010. In that speech, the now Democratic presidential candidate was critical of President Obama's extension of the Bush administration tax cuts for top earners and the disappearance of the middle class.
Thank you. That was such a wonderful introduction. I wish you just could have kept going and going. It was sounding very good. I want to thank Busboys and Poets for hosting this event and for all of the great work you do. Thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody. It's a wonderful crowd, and thank you all very much for coming out. Let me talk a bit about myself, kind of how I got to where I am. Then I'm going to read a few pages. I'll read the introduction to the book. Go on for 7 or 8 hours after that. They didn't tell you that, right? No. And then we'll take some questions and answers at 4 o'clock in the morning. As you heard, I am the longest serving independent in American congressional history, actually, as it were. And you may say, well, why is that? Why are you an independent? And the answer is pretty simple. It's that I believe that both political parties are heavily dominated by moneyed interest. And I think that millions and millions of working families don't have the kind of voice that they should be having in all levels of government. And I've chosen to be an independent. I caucus now with the Democrats, have always done that. I began my political career in Vermont by running for the United States Senate on a third-party ticket, running against Democrats and Republicans. And I received all of 2% of the vote. That was back in roughly 1971. And not deterred, I then ran for governor of the state of Vermont with the same third party called the Liberty Union Party, and I went from 2% to 1%. Not a kind of trajectory that we were hoping. But I may not be very bright, but I am persistent. Came back, ran for the Senate again in 1974 against my now colleague, Patrick Leahy. He won, I lost, but I got 4% of the vote in a three-way race. So I saw the votes going up, and then 2 years later, I ran for governor again. We have elections every 2 years in Vermont, and I got 6%. At that point, I took the hint that maybe getting elected to political office is not what my life was going to be about, and I went about doing other things, mostly doing some writing, working on historical film strips, and actually having a pretty good time. In 1981, you know how politicians always tell you that people came up and said you should run for office, and actually in my case it was true. There were a number of friends who said, you know what, we looked at the election results and you did really well in Burlington, and if you run in Burlington, which is the largest city in the state of Vermont, you might actually win. So I did, and we put together a wonderful coalition of unions and senior citizens and women's advocates and environmental advocates, and the police officers came on board. And on election night, we won by 14 votes, defeating a 5-term incumbent, which will probably go down in Vermont history as maybe the major, most significant political upset of modern Vermont history. Then we went to the recount, and I ended up winning by 10 votes. I took office in 1981 with 2 supporters on the city council, and the rest were Democrats and Republicans who were not particularly supportive. In fact, they fired my secretary on the first day I took office, and I had to run the city for the first year with the previous mayor's administration. It's like Obama running with Bush's administration. It was a little bit difficult, but a year later, we had rallied the people, and we won a number of seats in the city council. I developed veto power, and we began to do some really exciting things in Burlington. After 2 years, I ran for re-election against Democrat-Republican, won. 2 years later, ran against Democrat-Republican, won. And then they combined the parties and we won anyhow. That was in 1987. 1988, I ran for the United States Congress, and a lot of my liberal friends said, you shouldn't run because you'll be a spoiler. There's a strong Democrat running against a strong Republican. You're going to pull votes away. On election night, the Republican won with 34%. I got 31%. The Democrat got 19%. 2 years later, I ran for that same seat in the House, and I won by 16 points. There was not a strong Democrat in. Served there for 16 years. Ran for the United States Senate in 2006 when Senator Jim Jeffords, who many of you know, a very courageous person, chose not to run for re-election. He retired. We ran against one of the wealthiest guys in the state. Up until that point, the most that anyone had ever spent in an election in the state of Vermont was about $2.5 million. He spent $7 million. We had to raise $5 million, but we ended up winning by a very strong vote up for re-election in 2012. So that's my political history. Let me now take you to why you're here tonight. Let me talk a little bit about the book and read you from the introduction. On Friday, December 10th, 2010, I woke up at my usual time, had my usual breakfast of oatmeal and coffee at the Dirksen Senate building, and then had a typical daily discussion with some of my staff. At 10:30 a.m., I walked onto the floor of the Senate and began a speech. Turned out to be a very long speech, a modern version of the filibuster. It went on for 8.5 hours until 7 p.m. There were several reasons why I went to the floor for that speech. First, I had promised to do everything I could to oppose what I believed was a very bad tax agreement between President Barack Obama and the Republican leadership. At a time when this country has a $13.8 trillion national debt and the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country, it seemed to me totally absurd to provide hundreds of billions in tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires. Further, by confirming, and this was the lame duck session before the Republicans took control of the House, further by confirming under a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate, the basic tenets of Bush's horrendous trickle-down economic theory, this agreement was laying the groundwork for more bad decisions in the future. Unfortunately, I was absolutely right, and that takes us right to the Ryan Republican budget of today. Second, more tax breaks for the very rich is only one symptom of an economic and political system that is grotesquely failing the average American. The simple reality is that the middle class of America is collapsing, poverty is increasing, and the gap between the very wealthiest people and everyone else is getting wider. How did this happen? Why did it happen? What can we do about it? These are issues that had to be talked about, and talked about in a way that is not often heard in Washington. Over the 20 years that I had served in the House and the Senate, I had examined these issues far too often ignored by the corporate media and my colleagues in Congress, from a wide variety of perspectives. Now was an excellent opportunity to bring them together and to make the connections. What does it mean, morally and economically, that in 2007, the top 1% earned over 23% of all income in this country, more than the bottom 50%? Or that the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%? Given the enormous political power that goes with this concentration of wealth in terms of lobbying capabilities, campaign contributions, and media ownership, is the United States on its way to becoming an oligarchic form of society, with almost all power resting in the hands of a tiny few? What does it say about our economy and the political choices we make about it on Capitol Hill that today, despite all of the huge increases in productivity and technology that we've seen in recent decades, a two-income family now has less disposable income than a one-income family did 30 years ago? Why is it that Americans today work the longest hours of any people in the industrialized world? What is the correlation between the United States having by far the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country, while we also have more people in jail? Doesn't it make more sense to invest in our kids than in jail construction? How does it reflect upon our political and legal system when the crooks on Wall Street who caused this horrendous recession now earn more money than they did before their banks were bailed out by the taxpayers? How come none of them are in jail? And what does the financial reform bill mean when 3 out of the top 4 too big to fail banks in this country are now larger than they were before the Wall Street collapse, with assets of over half the GDP of this country? What does it mean to the economic future of our country that over the last 10 years we have lost 42,000 factories and millions of good-paying manufacturing jobs, and that it is harder and harder to buy products manufactured in America? How does it happen that CEOs of large corporations boast about the advantages of outsourcing their production and jobs to China, but when hard times hit, they come running to U.S. taxpayers for a bailout? And on and on and on. So those were some of the themes that I wanted to talk about in my remarks, and I wanted to tie some of the dots together. Now, what does it feel like to stand and talk for 8.5 hours when you can't leave the floor, eat, or most importantly, the question asked to me time and time again, especially by the media, how come you didn't go to the bathroom? How is that? And that's my secret, and I'm not telling. That's about it. You'll never know. And you're doing all of this with a national television camera on you. And the answer is, my profound answer is, it's hard. Try it sometime. Interestingly enough, the after effect hit me a few days later when I found myself very, very tired. During the speech itself, my legs began to cramp up a bit. My voice also became pretty hoarse. When I walked onto the floor, I had no idea how long I would stay there, none at all. When I was mayor of Burlington in the 1980s, I sometimes gave speeches for as long as an hour, and that was it. Would I last 3 hours, 5 hours, 20 hours? I really didn't know. What I was clear about in my own mind, however, was that I wasn't going to read from the phone book or sing songs, and you'll be happy to know I didn't sing any songs, believe me, just to eat up time. I wanted to speak for as long as I had something relevant to say. While I didn't have a prepared script for the speech, I mostly worked off of previous speeches I had given or articles that I had written, and occasionally excerpts from some books that I had read. I would read a few lines or pages and go off from there. Twice, colleagues came to the floor and engaged in what we call a colloquy. I remain grateful to Senator Sherrod Brown and Mary Landrieu for their support of my effort. Let me also warn the good readers of this book that it contains some repetition. Hey, what do you want, 8.5 hours? It's going to be something. And this is not an accident. In giving the speech, I was more than aware that most people were not going to be listening to it in its entirety. I suspected that most people would tune in for a half hour or an hour and then move on with their lives. I made it a point to keep returning to my basic themes. Was I surprised about the kind of attention that the speech received? Are you kidding? The phones in both my Washington and Vermont offices never stopped ringing. In Vermont, every one of my 8 staff people did nothing else all day but respond to calls, thousands of calls and emails. The Senate television website crashed because of the huge number of people who wanted to watch the speech live, online, and apparently C-SPAN 2 had an exceptional day. According to the New York Times, my speech was the most tweeted event in the world on that day. What a distinction. Never knew it. Most tweeted event. And someday I will learn what Twitter is all about. There were front page stories in newspapers all around the country, and the speech was covered widely in the international media. The number of people who signed up as friends on my Facebook page doubled the previous total in one day, and visits to my website went sky high. Some journalists even claimed that Obama had an unscheduled impromptu press conference with former President Bill Clinton, who defended the tax deal in order to divert media attention away from what I was doing on the Senate floor. Just turned out Clinton was in the White House, there was no press, and they suddenly had a press conference and captured a lot of attention. Despite my best efforts and the hard work of many other members of Congress, we lost the vote on the tax deal that President Obama worked out with the Republicans, a very bad agreement was signed into law. Was my 8.5-hour speech worth the effort? Absolutely. If this country is going to move forward in a new direction, if we're going to save the middle class and change our national priorities, we have got to cut through the fog and obfuscation of the corporate mainstream media and start focusing on the life and death issues that working families really care about. The very strong response to my speech tells me that there is a hunger all over America for a discussion about economic truths, for a counterattack on the ferocious assaults that are taking place against working families, and for a practical plan on how we can reverse the obscene politics that favor the rich over the middle class and the disadvantaged in our nation. If my speech helped educate people about some of these issues, made them aware that they're not alone in their concerns or their pain, and pointed a way to the future, it was well worth it. That's it. Thank you. Okay, what I would love to do now is to take any questions or thoughts that anybody may have. Just be loud, ma'am. Yes?
Okay. I'm sorry, no, we do microphone, so
Okay.
you don't have to shout so everyone can hear you, and only speak if you have the microphone. Just keep it orderly and respectful.
Yes, thank you for everything you do. What's your advice on what we or what Congress, et cetera, should be doing about the Citizens United decision? Does it have to have an amendment to the Constitution, or are there better ways to do it?
All right, let me just back that excellent question up, because perhaps everybody doesn't know what the Citizens United decision is about. For many, many years, we have had a disastrous campaign finance system which clearly favors those people who have a lot of money and corporate interest against those of us who do not. A year or so ago, our Supreme Court, by a 5-4 decision, passed a disastrous, absurd decision called the Citizens United decision. And in their wisdom, we found actually 5 people in the same room, the only 5 people in America, who actually believe that a corporation is a person. There are 5 people in America, and they all have to be on the Supreme Court at the same time. And essentially what that decision does is it says to large corporations that you, being a person, have First Amendment freedom of speech rights. And therefore, you are able to express your freedom of speech by putting 30-second ads on television telling the world how terrible Bernie Sanders is, or Russ Feingold is, or anybody else is. And by the way, you can do that in secrecy. You don't even have to reveal who you are. You can come up with some phony name and phony organization. This is a disastrous decision which makes a very bad campaign finance situation much worse. We saw it in the last election. You're going to see a lot more of it. Essentially what's going to happen is a handful of billionaires and very wealthy corporate people are going to sit around the room and say, okay, you're putting $10 million into Vermont, you're putting into New Hampshire, you got $20 million into California, and for these guys, this is a small sum of money to win a Senate seat or a House seat. It is a horrendous decision. Now, what we have tried to do on the floor of the House and the Senate is at least pass some legislation that would minimize the impact of Citizens United. So there was legislation that was brought forth, which not shockingly got no Republican support, which said, okay, if I put an ad on television attacking my opponent, which I've never done, I've never run a negative ad, I have to have my name on TV and say, I take responsibility for this ad. So we said, fine, if you are a CEO of a corporation who is paying for this ad, get your face up there and say, you take responsibility for this ad. And we thought that would discourage a lot of corporations from doing that. Second of all, we wanted to make sure that if a Chinese company in the United States owned significantly by Chinese interests, that they should not be allowed to participate in American politics. Thirdly, what we wanted to do is say, okay, if you utilize that, then your opponent, somebody attacked me using that process, I would be able to get the cheapest possible rates available to respond. Anyhow, we lost those votes. We couldn't get any Republicans. Well, for Republicans, this is a very good Supreme Court decision. Your question is, should we go forward with a constitutional amendment? In general, I have to tell you, I'm not a great fan of constitutional amendments. People think, everybody who has a problem, we need a constitutional amendment to solve it. That kind of weakens what our Constitution is about, which is a pretty good document. But on this issue, I think we can make the exception to that rule. So I do believe that certainly a constitutional amendment is one of the options that we have. And that amendment should simply say that a corporation, to everyone's shock and surprise, is not a person. Last point that I would say on this issue, we had a town meeting. We do a lot of town meetings in Vermont. We had one a couple of months ago, had a whole lot of people out. And Ben and Jerry's, many of you know Ben and Jerry's. So Ben was there and Jerry was there, and Ben was very funny. He says, I'm Ben, I am a person. This is Jerry, he's a person. Ben and Jerry's, not a person. And in a nutshell, that's about it. The idea that we give corporations First Amendment rights is absurd.
Kennedy?
I'm just wondering, we missed out on Kyoto signing that. It looks like cap and trade is dead. What would you recommend our advocacy be for some sort of global?
Well, I think,
change?
In my view, global warming is a huge, huge issue. And it saddens me very much that today in the Congress, you have certainly a majority of people in the House, almost all Republicans, including intelligent people, who are willing to ignore virtually the entire scientific community, who tells us global warming is real, that global warming is today, causing very, very serious problems, and that those problems are only going to get worse in the future. You have the CIA telling us that in terms of national security, global warming, which can lead to wars as people around the world fight over limited resources because of droughts and floods and food shortages. You got the CIA, you got the Defense Department, the Agriculture, all these organizations all over the world saying it. And yet the anti-science feeling on Capitol Hill is such that we certainly, at this particular political moment, are not going to move forward on global warming. But to answer your question, it's not just global warming. We could talk about education. We can talk about healthcare. What are the answers? And the main point that I want to make to you is the solution is not going to come inside the Beltway. The solution is going to come in cities and towns all over this country where ordinary people begin to stand up and organize and get out on the streets and say, enough is enough. I can tell you, without any fear of contradiction, that what goes on in Congress is far, far removed from the reality of the lives of ordinary people. And that's true whether it's economics, that's true whether it's healthcare. What goes on in Congress is there's an invisible wall infiltrated by lobbyists and very powerful corporate interest who shape the whole discussion, shape the debate. You have a corporate media out there which will talk about everything in the world except issues that are most important to ordinary people. So global warming is a huge issue, and right now I don't think there's anyone who thinks we're going to make serious advances in addressing that. What we may be able to do is to get some investment in energy efficiency, and the state of Vermont has done a very good job in that area. Get some investments in sustainable energies like wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, and others. Get some investments in public transportation. But as you'll notice, for example, just in this recent CR that was passed in order to prevent Republicans from shutting down the government, Obama had to give up on billions of dollars on high-speed rail. High-speed rail. So instead of investing in public transportation and in rail, we have to cut back on that, and I fear very much that as this debate goes forward on the budget, you're going to see more of these cutbacks. But to answer your question, and the other questions that are on your mind, we can turn this thing around. I believe that we can. There are very few people in America not located inside the Capitol who believe that it makes any sense at all to give $1 trillion in tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country, to cut the corporate tax rate, at a time when many corporations making billions of dollars already pay nothing in taxes, and then having given huge tax breaks to people who don't need it, cut back on infrastructure, cut back on the needs of our children, cut back to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars on Medicaid, voucherize Medicare. Very few people believe that makes any sense at all. But our job is to cut through a media which in many ways doesn't discuss this issue, take on the big money interests who sponsor members of Congress through large campaign contributions and organize and educate. And if we do that, we're going to win this fight.
Senator, thank you very much for being America's senator. 2012, you're up for re-election. Has opposition been mounted yet? Have they started to spend money against you yet?
No, they have not started to spend money. We think there's at least one serious candidate out there, and there may be others. But as of this point, they have not spent money against me.
Hi, Senator. Thank you. I'm a proud Vermonter. I'm wondering, there seems to be increasing conversation about race in this country with the birther movement and then also immigration laws that are passing, and there's also increasing conversation about wealth inequality. Are you finding a conversation happening about racial wealth inequality?
A good question. I'll tell you what we intend to do on that issue in the area that I have some jurisdiction. There are some very frightening statistics out there that we don't talk enough about, having to do that poverty in America is in many ways a death sentence. And what I mean by that is if you look, for example, you contrast in terms of racial disparities, say a rich white guy who has access to good quality health care, disease prevention, doesn't live under an enormous amount of stress because he'll have the income he needs, etc. Contrast that to a low-income black person, and you're going to see a very significant discrepancy and disparity in longevity. So I think you're going to see that, and we're going to do a hearing and get some studies done on that. But the fact of the matter is, whether you're black, white, Hispanic, or whatever, when you're poor, you're going to live a shorter lifespan, and the quality of your life will not be as good as somebody else. And I think those are important issues to pound away at.
I'm sure you're going to stand strong for a clean debt ceiling bill. I hope you can get Democrats to stand strong. I believe we have the leverage because no one wants the debt ceiling raised more than the Wall Street banks, who are the heart and soul of the Republican Party. They will suffer the most from that. And we've got to stand up to the crazy Tea Party nuts and their governors and a bunch. They need it a lot more than we do, and we cannot let them cut necessary spending as an excuse here.
Okay. That's a very good question, and I agree with you. Let me back it up so that everybody knows what we're talking about. And let's be honest about this. And I do a radio show every Friday, so we speak with a fellow named Tom Hartman. I don't know if you know Tom. Does a great job. And we talk to a couple of million people, and every week somebody raises this issue. The issue they raise is, why is it that the Republicans are so tough, they don't compromise, and Democrats compromise all of the time? Is that right? Okay. Now that's the question they raise. And I just look at what's happened in the last year. In terms of what this book is about, what the Republicans said is, okay, there are several million people whose unemployment compensation is going to expire. But we don't want to extend unemployment. And unless you give us, and by the way, that was ahistorical, because historically, when unemployment was above a certain level, where we are right now, generally there was bipartisan support for extending unemployment. The Republicans said, we're not going to do it. And Obama and the Democrats said, well, that's terrible. You got to do it. And the Republicans said, okay, we'll do it, but this is what we need from you. We need to extend Bush's tax breaks for the wealthiest people. We need to lower the tax rates on the estate tax, which go to the very, very wealthiest people, top 0.3%, going to bring those things down. And we are delighted that you're going to divert, and this was not the Republicans' idea, they supported it, $120 billion from the Social Security Fund by doing a tax holiday on the payroll tax for workers. Okay? It's $120 billion not going into Social Security. That was what they demanded, and essentially they got everything that they wanted. I thought, and that's why I was on the floor for 8.5 hours, that was a very poor compromise. You got to give, but that was a very poor compromise, which Republicans got 90% of what they wanted. All right, their threat was, we are not going to extend unemployment benefits. Now, a few weeks ago, what was the blackmail then? The blackmail was, if you don't give us the cuts that we want, we're going to shut down the government. And 800,000 federal employees are not going to have a paycheck. Government services are not going to be available to people. You better give us what we want, or we're going to shut down the government. Well, I voted against that. The Democrats fought back. They protected Head Start. They protected Planned Parenthood. But among other things, a program that I worked very, very hard on, which is community health centers, which are providing health care to 20 million people. We got to increase that investment so that in 5 years, we're going to have 40 million people be able to get primary health care, dental care, low-cost prescription drugs, mental health counseling. And they started cutting back $600 million off of that program. Millions of people not going to have access in the future to community health center health care. All right? So their blackmail there was, we're going to shut the government down. And Democrats fought back a little bit, but not enough. Now, to your point, we're in part 3 of the movie. And this time is, unless you make devastating cuts or lay the groundwork for devastating cuts in the future, we, for the first time in the history of this great country, are not going to pay our debts. We're going to default on our debts. We're going to cause an international financial crisis, the outcome of which nobody knows. Will it lead to a world depression? Will it lead to higher interest rates? Almost definitely. It will mean that for the first time in the history of this country, people who buy bonds from the United States are going to have second thoughts about that. Republicans have said, we're prepared to do that. We're prepared to do that unless you give us what we want. And this is like, a child having a temper tantrum. I'm going to go nuts when company is in the house unless you give me the candy, or I'm going to burn down the place unless you give me what I want. Well, what the questioner suggests, which is an interesting point, is that probably the first group of people who are going to be hit hardest by not raising the debt ceiling will be Wall Street. And I agree with you. I happen to think that our friends on Wall Street who own a good part of the Republican Party will probably not allow their employees to do that. So I think we have got to hang tough, because the point is, it never ends. See, these guys are very bold, they are very tough, and they are very irresponsible. If my suggestion to the president is to say to them, to look them in the eye, and to say, if you want to, for the first time in this country, default on our debt, if you want to send the world into a financial crisis, you go ahead and do it. And the voters are going to hold you accountable in the next election. But we are not going to keep surrendering on issue after issue. Okay, any other questions?
So, what does Sunday's news about bin Laden mean for the war on terror?
The question is, what do... say your question again, be loud.
So, what do you foresee for the war on terror? Is it going to be more dangerous, or...?
One can't predict that. I think, as I was coming back to Washington, and I went through the Burlington, Vermont airport, there were a lot of people who said, Bernie, isn't this a great day? And I share that. Look, you got a guy out there, and one doesn't know in the last few years how actively he was involved in terrorist movements, because he was kind of isolated. And we'll learn more about that, I suspect, within the next few weeks. But this is a guy who not only on 9/11, but in other activities killed thousands and thousands of innocent men, women, and children. And I think the world is better off without him. Now, when I'm asked on Capitol Hill by some of the media, well, what does this mean about the war in Afghanistan and so forth and so on. Number one, if anyone thinks that it was Osama bin Laden single-handedly running the international war on terrorism and that with his demise suddenly everything is going to be fine, that is a naive point of view. That is not the case. You got cells all over the world and people who want to do very, very bad things. I think psychologically, the taking him out does have a positive impact. I think more importantly, the growth of democratic movements in the Middle East are very, very significant. In terms of what it means, I'm asked about Afghanistan, for example. My view didn't really change the day before he was killed or the day after. We have been there for 10 years, and I was in Afghanistan a couple of months ago. It is an enormously complicated and difficult situation. What you have is a country which is terribly, terribly poor and undeveloped. Do you know how much education the average police officer in Afghanistan today has? Zero. Functionally illiterate. And in fact, I went to a place where an international group, Germany, the United States, Ireland, I think, and others, were training police officers in Afghanistan with the hope that they would leave with a first grade or maybe even a third grade education. I visited a village in the southern part of the country which I suspect did not look a lot different than it did over the last 1,000 years. The Taliban had been strong there. We had a nice little walk down the street with a few senators and half the United States Marine Corps. Strange sight. But you walk down the main street there and you see these guys selling vegetables or meat or whatever it is. I did not see one woman. I did not see one woman out on the street in mid-afternoon. They were all behind closed doors. They don't go out in public. So it is the goal here in Afghanistan is to make sure that this Taliban never again assumes power. That would be very bad for a wide variety of reasons. On the other hand, after 10 long years, I believe that the time now is to bring our troops home as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you for coming tonight to speak to the people. My question is, you mentioned multiple times that Congress is dominated by money interests. What's your opinion of the Israeli lobby in Congress? And what's your plan on achieving justice for the Palestinian people and supporting democracy in Arab people?
I think the Israeli lobby is one of many, many lobbies in Washington. And my hope is that the president will work with Israel and the Arab countries and people of all political persuasions to develop what I suspect will be a two-state solution. And I think we have to be aggressive. It breaks my heart, because I've been to the Middle East, to see decent people on both sides in this never-ending violence. So I would hope that the United States will play an active role. It is very difficult because you got loonies on both sides trying to tear it apart. But I would hope that we can bring people together so that this never-ending violence comes to an end.
We have time for 2 more questions. There are 2 people up here, actually, and then we will end the evening.
Did you know George Seldes?
He lived in Vermont. I didn't know him personally, but he did live in Vermont, yes. Didn't know him personally. George Seldes, by the way, was, any of you know who George Seldes was? He was a, oh, did you? He was kind of, any of you hear of I.F. Stone? Seldes was, in a sense, a mentor, I think, intellectually for Stone. He was one of these guys, one of these independent journalists who actually read material and asked hard questions and wrote a whole lot of books. He was a wonderful writer who I think, if my memory is correct, lived the last years of his life in the state of Vermont, but I'd never met him, sorry to say. In Burlington, did he? Okay, one more question, I think.
Hi there.
Hi.
Senator Sanders, I know that recently you have had some strong words for the Commodity Futures Trading Commission.
Yes, I did.
Yes, and And as a car owner who's thinking about turning in my car for a bicycle, I'd like to know exactly, what do you think? Yeah, I'm in favor too. What exactly do you think is Congress's role in sort of mitigating the economic effects of the rising gas prices on American citizens?
Good question. And by the way, in my office, and remember, I live, we came here, Huck Gutman and Mike Briggs and I came here on your subway, but we don't have subways like this in Vermont. So to get to work in Vermont and all over rural America, you drive. And what happens is that you've got millions of working people, many of whom have seen a decline in their wages, and now are paying $4 or more for a gallon of gas. And that's coming right out of their paycheck, and it's making their very sorry economic situation today even worse. Now, here's what you got with gas prices. And let me just back it up a little bit to our friends on Wall Street. When you talk to people in Vermont or any place else in this country, people are very, very angry. There was a poll today, I think it was a Gallup poll, and what the poll showed, I believe for the first time, is that people now believe that their kids are going to have a lower standard of living than they do. Got that? For the very first time. You know, my parents never had any money at all. And my dad worked his whole life, never made a whole lot of money. We lived in a small apartment. But their dream was like everybody else's dream. Every parent dreams that your kids are going to do better than you, especially if you start off without any money. So all over this country now, people are saying, you know what? My kid is going to have less education than I did. My kid is going to earn lower wages than I did. And there's a lot of despair and anger all over this country. And if you would ask me one issue, one fact that symbolizes that, is people saw the crooks on Wall Street, and I use that word very advisedly, the crooks on Wall Street whose greed and recklessness and illegal behavior destroy our economy, throw millions and millions of people out of their jobs. People lost their homes. People lost their life savings when Wall Street collapsed, the stock market went down. And now, after they were bailed out by the people of this country, those guys on Wall Street making more money than they ever did before. And not one of these guys is in jail. Some kid throws a brick through a window, kid goes to jail. These people destroy an entire economy, they end up making tens of millions of dollars in compensation. What all of that is about is, I think, people beginning to understand that these guys have so much wealth and so much power that they are untouchable. That they can commit a crime in mid-daylight, a terrible crime, the whole world is looking at it, destroying millions of lives, and they say, ain't nothing you can do to me because I own the United States Congress. You can't touch me, I'm too powerful. You're not going to throw me in jail. So what if I destroyed millions of lives? Okay? And that is, in my view, the real reality. Now, how does that deal with your fine question about gas prices? What you're seeing right now is the theory of oil prices is supply and demand, right? That's capitalist economics. When supply is limited and demand is high, prices go up, right? We all learned that in Economics 101. So let me be the first to tell you right now, there is more oil supply in America today than there was a year ago. And on top of that, there is less demand in America today than there was a year ago. More supply, less demand. What's supposed to happen? Prices are supposed to go down, they're going off the wall. The reason for that is our friends at Exxon Mobil and the other large corporations, many of which, by the way, make huge profits and pay nothing in taxes, but that's an aside. What they have done is use the excuse of unrest in the Middle East as a reason to raise prices. That's issue number one. But they're not alone. And one of the amusing things that's taking place now is you're seeing a division to some degree between the oil companies and Wall Street, because the oil companies are saying, yeah, we're greedy, we're selfish, that's true, but we're not the only ones. What you're seeing now is speculation from Wall Street, where these Wall Street firms are bidding up oil future prices. They never use the product, they're just making money as prices go up. Under the financial reform bill passed a year ago, We gave authority to an arcane commission that nobody in the world has ever heard of, called the Commodities Future Trading Commission, to, in fact, end extreme speculation. Okay, that was what their job was. They have not done it. And I have urged the president to take action. If these guys don't want to do it, get their resignations. But a whole lot of people, working people, and the economy as a whole are suffering while the oil companies and Wall Street make a whole lot of money. But this would be a perfect example of the powerlessness of Congress to deal with very powerful entities who are making huge sums of money. All right, thank you for the question. Let me just conclude by thanking...
Senator Sanders, I forgot that it was my fault. I forgot we started earlier this evening so we could have a longer Q&A. So we do have time for about 3 or 4 more questions.
Okay, well, let's do that.
Okay. So I know there's some people on this side over here, so I'll come to you.
On the balcony, on the stairs.
Hi, Senator Sanders. You're doing a great job. What I wanted to ask was, do you know anything about the quantitative easing that's going on, like approximately $1 trillion is being printed as we speak? And I was just wondering, like, where that money is going to. Is it going to be for creating jobs or what, to pay the debt?
This is through the Fed?
I guess so. And also the timing of it. Is it going to be spent all at once? Because I'm just worried about like hyperinflation happening. So I was just wondering.
The answer is no, I honestly don't know. But let me, as a good politician, let me pick up on the point that you raised and go someplace else, because you reminded me of something. And that is an issue that there's an interesting, to some degree, coming together of the left and the right, and that is the Fed in general. Okay. Now, I had serious doubts about the financial reform bill, the Dodd-Frank bill, because I didn't think it went anywhere near far enough. I mean, among other things, as I mentioned in the introduction, we bailed out these huge financial institutions because they were too big to fail, i.e., if they went down, they would take a good part of the economy with them, massive unemployment, we had to bail them out. I didn't vote to bail them out, but my colleagues did. And then we find out that after the bailout, 3 out of the 4 are even larger today, and a number of economists believe that at some point we're going to see a repetition of what we saw a few years ago. Now, what I got into the bill, working with, this is interesting, my right-wing friend Ron Paul. And Paul and I had worked together when we were in the House on some issues, but this is an interesting coming together of the right and the left. And that is, what we wanted to do is an audit of the Fed. What I ended up getting is a couple of things. I didn't get everything I wanted, we got a lot. And that is, during the bailout, all of you remember there's a whole lot of debate about the TARP, the bailout, which was, if my memory is correct, about $700–800 billion. And I voted against it, and it ended up passing. Bottom line is, and the American people were outraged by this, we're bailing out the people who caused the problem, et cetera, et cetera. In any case, if you want to know who received that TARP money, you go to the US Department of Treasury, go to their website, you'll find where every nickel went. It was pretty transparent. At the same time, with very little discussion, our friends at the Fed, Ben Bernanke and company, were lending out $3 trillion at very low interest rates. And as a member of the Budget Committee a couple of years ago, Bernanke came before the committee and I said, Mr. Bernanke, my constituents, people of America, want to know which financial institutions got the money. Where did it go? How do you get it? And then I was very clever and I said, do you have to be a totally dishonest major financial institution to get the money, or could you be an honest business person? Is there an 800 number that you have to call up? He didn't think it was all that funny. In any case, he said, no, I'm not going to tell you. And on that day, we introduced legislation to bring transparency. And we managed to get that provision in the financial reform bill. And a couple of months ago, the GAO did the work, and they did a good job, and they revealed where the $3 trillion went. Needless to say, every major financial institution in this country got huge amounts of very, very low interest loans. What was also surprising, you'll all be delighted to know, that at the same time as small businesses all over this country can't receive, are not able to find affordable loans, virtually every central bank in the world, including Arab central banks, Korean central banks, also got a bailout, as well as wealthy families in this country, as well as large corporations like General Electric. Okay? They all got a bailout, and that was made public. We also learned that one of the Arab banks that got a bailout is now majority owned by Libya. I mean, that's how crazy it is. We are also looking at the Fed. Now, the point about this rant here is the Fed is an enormously important agency, enormously important, of which the American people know very little. So we're fighting to bring transparency. Also, you have bankers sitting around the room deciding who got these loans in what I consider to be direct conflicts of interest, and we have a provision which I hope will be implemented in July where the GAO will be talking about conflicts of interest. In a sense, people being part of a process in which they benefit very handsomely. But the Fed is a huge issue, and we need to work much more aggressively on that issue. And the function of the Fed, in my view, should be to protect the middle class, to create decent paying jobs in this country, and not just to bail out very large financial institutions.
My question is also about the federal reform. The Consumer Protection Agency that was part of that bill, President Obama's named Elizabeth Warren to set it up. Is that thing going to have any teeth at all? And why do you think he didn't do a recess appointment, just put her through if she couldn't get through the Senate?
It's funny that you raised that issue about Elizabeth. I've known Elizabeth for many, many years. Elizabeth is one of the smartest people that I have ever known. She came to Vermont to do some town meetings in economics with me. And what I love about Elizabeth is she is able to take difficult economic and financial concepts and translate them into English so that people know what she's talking about. And I will tell you that I did more lobbying to get Elizabeth appointed than on any other issue. Because I will tell you this also. When not long into the Obama administration, I can't remember, 6 months, 8 months after he was in, a number of, well, not a number, half a dozen senators went to the White House to meet with him. And we said, you know, Mr. President, we are concerned that you are surrounding yourself with all the same old Wall Street guys, whether it's Larry Summers or Geithner, etc. And so I was determined, and he gave his reasons why, etc. But I was determined that there at least, I would do everything I could to make sure there was at least one progressive voice there, and certainly Elizabeth has that background. Now, there are a lot of Republicans who are not enamored with Elizabeth. I certainly would have supported a recess appointment. I hope Elizabeth will get the permanent appointment, which she does not have right now. But she is an extremely capable person who is dealing with issues that are of enormous importance. You know, if you look at the Bible, or if you look at any other religious tract, you know, whether it's the Quran, whether it's whatever it may be, the charging of high interest rates usually is considered to be immoral. And the theory is that if you don't have a lot of money and I'm lending you money, it is wrong to kind of get blood from a stone. I shouldn't be charging you such outrageous high interest rates. Today in America, we get calls on this all the time. You get working people who are paying 25, 30% interest rates on their credit cards. That's usury. That is no different than loan sharking. You know, I don't know that they go around breaking kneecaps now like the gangsters used to do it, but they punish people if they don't pay. And this is an issue I know that Elizabeth has been working on and thinking about, but it is certainly something that I hope we can deal with through her agency. Okay, maybe just a couple more questions.
Senator, a few months ago you actually got on the floor of the Senate and actually filibustered. I'm wondering, since the supermajority requiring 60 votes, et cetera, whether the Republicans have gotten away with saying, well, we're going to filibuster you, so there goes that. I'm wondering, what do you see might have been different had the Democrats said, okay, you're threatening us with a filibuster? Filibuster. Get on the floor and talk.
I think that's an excellent question. And I can tell you that there are a number of people all over this country and a number of us in the Senate who feel the same way. Harry Reid is a good friend of mine, and I like Harry very much. His dilemma always is that he believes that he has a job, that we have a job to pass legislation to address the problems facing America, which is what his job is about. That's what the leader's job is. I think that we could have and should pick a particular issue. Now, what the gentleman is talking about is we have seen a record level of obstructionism on the part of the Republicans from the day after Obama was elected. They made it very clear. You want to accomplish something, you ain't going to do it. In the old days, it was very rare for people to require the 60 votes, for you to have to break the 60 votes to get cloture. That was very, very rare. Now, on almost any significant piece of legislation, they have demanded 60 votes, which is very, very difficult to get. Just one example. During the health care reform debate, I introduced a legislation which would call for a Medicare for All single-payer program. And by the way, I hope that my state of Vermont is going to lead the nation in that direction. We're working hard on that. In any case, I had no illusion at all that this was going to win. No way. I mean, I thought we'd get somewhere between 5 and 10 votes. But I thought it important to get it out there. It would have been the first time in history that a single-payer program had been voted on. I got up there to introduce the legislation, and a Republican colleague refused. What you do when you introduce legislation, you say, I ask that the bill be considered as read. In other words, you don't have to read the whole bill. This guy got up and said, I object. I want the whole bill read. It's a long bill. Would have required 16 hours of reading. That is called, and this bill wasn't even going to win. Lucky to get 10 votes. But that's called obstructionism. And that's what they have been doing. So I agree with you. I think we should have picked an issue where the Republicans objected and let the American people shut it down and let the media and the American people focus on that issue. And if it takes a week, it takes 2 weeks, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, let's do it. That would have been my preference, and I think the preference of some other people.
Senator Sanders has indicated that he's getting a little tired. It's not going to be another historic 8.5 hours here with us this evening. This is truly the last question for the evening, and I want to thank all of you for coming out.
Well, Senator Sanders, you caucus with the Democrats, but you identify as an independent, which I think in this day and age deserves a great deal of respect. I know that a lot of us here in 2008, the word on the street was hope and change, and we were hoped for a sea change in Washington politics, and sad to say, it didn't come to pass the way a lot of us did hope. And I do believe that there was a lot of ill feeling over the year 2000, over the so-called native spoiler effect. But I think I'm not alone in saying, looking at the way the extremists on the far right have managed to capture the conversation, and those of us on the left have been left behind, have been ignored. Do you see a place for more independent candidates, more third-party candidates? Would you support, possibly, if President Obama continues to listen more to his critics on the right and his critics on the left, voting for a primary challenger in 2012, or voting for a third party?
You'll allow me not to answer that specifically, only in this sense. I mean, because it's, anybody can run for any office they want to run. If you're asking me, am I going to be involved in that process? No, I'm not. But here's what I think. And I speak with some knowledge about this because I am an independent. I have run on third parties, and I'm the longest serving independent in congressional history. I think you got to be judicious about it. In other words, I think in the real world, I mean, you can say, I don't give a damn about anything. I'm going to run for office, and I don't really care if you have a right-wing Republican, a right-wing Senate, I really don't care. I'm running on principle. I mean, that's fine. I can understand that. I disagree with that. I think, however, all over this country, there are opportunities for progressive candidates to run, and if you want to run outside of the Democratic Party, I think if the context is right, do it. I did it. I mean, I was telling you that in 1988, I was told not to run because I would be a spoiler. It turns out I got a lot more votes than the Democrat did then. So I think you got to be judicious about it. And I think also whether you choose to run within the Democratic Party or outside of the Democratic Party, this I do believe. You know, I think that the Republican agenda of tax breaks for billionaires and savage cuts on the needs of the middle class and working families, these guys really do want to take us back to the 1920s where, you know, if you were old and you were poor, you were on your own. No health care for you, didn't matter. If you were a kid, didn't matter. Workers had no rights. Do not underestimate. These are serious people. They're not fooling around. They want to take us back to the 1920s, to an oligarchic form of society where power rested with a handful of very, very wealthy people. I think that their views, that ideology, is way, way, way out of touch with what the American people believe. Now, one of the problems that we have is you got a media which does a pretty poor job, which is, you know, also corporately owned to a large degree, not to mention a television station which is theirs completely. So you got that problem. But I think whether you run within the Democratic Party or not, I beg of you, do not become cynical, do not give up on the political process. We are fighting for not only our generation, but for our kids and our grandchildren. I have 6 grandchildren. I take their future seriously, okay? And we do not have the option of not fighting. We can beat these guys. We can beat them. Nobody believes in their ideology. Nobody thinks that children in America should not have health care or that workers should not have rights. They are a fringe movement. And if the Democrats have the guts to go out, to organize, if we work together on this thing, we can beat them and beat them badly. But, all right. But we can't do it. I know that it's hard. Look, I mean, I know people in my state, all over this country, are disappointed. I'm disappointed. All right, but you can't give up. We got to raise that progressive agenda, make it loud and clear, organize people around that, educate your neighbors, because what we are fighting for is so, so important. It is the future of this country. So I just want to thank Busboys and Poets for hosting this. Thank you so much for your introduction. Thank you all very much for coming out.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.